I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context on BBC News.
We are not deterred. We have stood strongly together to defend and protect our homeland.
We couldn't imagine that after a year of suffering, hostages will still be in captivity. We thought that a year after October 7th, all will be together. We'll be able to commemorate those who passed away, who were killed and executed.
The fact that we are a year into the war and the hostages are not back, most of all, we feel it's not even concern. We feel that everybody hasn't done everything they should have been doing.
Israel is at war. It's at war on multiple fronts, still in Gaza. There's a lot of trouble on the West Bank, and they are sending 2 more divisions, I believe, into South Lebanon.
Joining me tonight, Emily Harding, Director of the Centre for International Studies, Intelligence, National Security and Technology Programme, Justin Crump, CEO at Ciberline, Anja Manuel, the Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum and a former US State Department official, and Lord Kim Darroch, former UK Ambassador to the United States. It's a great panel. We will get to them all through the course of the next hour. First, though, let me bring you the latest BBC News. Services and memorials have been taking place for the 1,200 Israelis killed and more than 250 taken hostage in the Hamas attacks exactly a year ago. A moment's silence was held in Tel Aviv at a memorial organised by the families of the hostages still held in Gaza. World leaders have also been marking the day. President Biden, who lit a ceremonial candle in the White House, said the US was committed to Israel's security and said far too many civilians have suffered far too much during this year of conflict. The British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, called October the 7th the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. There were rockets fired at Israel today from both Gaza and Lebanon after the events of a year ago led to an escalation of war across the region. In an address to the nation today, Prime Minister Netanyahu vowed to stop such an attack ever happening again. And in other news, 4 pupils are being treated in hospital after a school bus overturned in Northern Ireland. The ambulance service there says 43 people and a driver were on board the vehicle when it crashed in County Down. If you are just joining us, welcome to the programme. The dawn ceremony in a clearing at the Reim Forest, the site of the Nova Music Festival, took place under heavy security this morning. The songs and prayers for those killed, accompanied by the sound of Israeli airstrikes just across the border in Gaza. The minute's silence interrupted by the piercing cries of a bereaved mother. It has been the most solemn day, filled with sadness and suffering, but not a day in isolation. For Israelis, for Palestinians, indeed for the entire region, every day of this past year is like some nightmare from which there is no awakening, especially for the families who grieve.
This is where she was, this is where she was happy in the last her moments, it was here.
You know, we tried to look for her for almost 5 weeks, as Anat said, and we tried to look for her tattoo over here, which said, "Die with memories, not dreams," which give you another meaning suddenly.
And then there are those families whose loved ones were taken across the border into Gaza. Through it all, more than 60 living hostages and the bodies of about 35 believed to be dead are still in Gaza. For them, the hope appears to be retreating with every new and related crisis connected to October 7th. Hamas has not given any accurate information as to who is alive, who is dead. Many families have been in the dark for a year. Their loved ones used as human shields. Some compare their situation to being trapped in a swamp, unable to move forward.
until Tal and the rest of our community members, and there is 101 hostages, until they come back, I don't know what my future is. At the moment, everything is day to day.
The entire Middle East is waiting for Israel's response to the Iranian ballistic missile attack last week. Joe Biden does not want them to attack Iran's nuclear facilities or the petrochemical industry, but there is a lot of pressure in Israel to disregard the president's advice. Opposition politician Benny Gantz, a former Minister of Defence, argued in the New York Times this weekend that Iran has built a ring of fire around his country. Iran, he says, is waiting for its chance to annihilate Israel. Now, says the Prime Minister, is the time to confront it.
We are changing the security reality of our region for the sake of our children, for the sake of our future, and to ensure what happened on October 7th will not happen again.
And so, today, a year on, Israel fights on three fronts. It is a country at war. 135 rockets were fired by Hezbollah just today, some intercepted above the Israeli city of Haifa. 2 divisions of Israeli troops have been deployed to the northern border. We'll speak throughout this hour with our panel about where this goes next, whether Israel does have a strategic endgame in mind, and what role the Arab states will play in finding that solution. But first, let us turn to someone who was there on October 7th, one of the 3,500 attendees at the Nova Music Festival. Yoni Dillon is a filmmaker from Tel Aviv. He escaped that day on foot, walking 5 hours to safety. But 2 of his friends were killed, 2 others were kidnapped. Yoni, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
Is there anyone in particular you were thinking of today?
Yes, Almog Sarusi, a good friend of mine. He went to high school with me. He was one of the hostages, the 6 hostages that was held in Gaza. He was supposed to be released in the hostage deal, and last minute, the Hamas terrorists, they shot all the 6 hostages, including Almog and including Hirsch, an American citizen, and they put a bullet in his head, and he didn't survive it. So. Sad day.
I'm really sorry. What would you like the political leaders to do about trying to get the hostages who are still alive home? What could be done to change the equation?
Look, I'm not a big politics fan, to be honest, and I don't understand too much about it. So I don't really have an opinion about politics. But I know that we have 101 hostages down in Gaza, and I see people chanting on the street ceasefire, and it sounds really hypocritical to say that when there's 101 hostages in Gaza, Israeli innocent hostages, families, babies, and they're yelling ceasefire. I think it's definitely something that sounds absurd, and you can't even talk about it. So I think right now we have to deal with the war right now. We're dealing with Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah in the north, and Hamas. And that's really the best thing we could do right now, strategically. But a year later, October 7th, there's a lot of mixed emotions on this day.
I was going to ask you at the top, actually, what your reflections were today. But I guess you've been reflecting on it every day. I don't suppose October 7th is a day of reflection for you. It's been a constant thing throughout the year.
Exactly. Look, October 7th for Israelis, it's a big traumatic event, right? It's like 9/11 for Americans. Today, I'm here in New York, and I see protests and enchantments on the streets, people yelling that 7/10 should happen again. It's like yelling 9/11 should happen again. You interview people on the streets and you ask them, what are you protesting for? A lot of people don't even know what they're protesting for. They're sure they're doing the right thing, like a social movement, like climate change. And some really don't know. And you gotta free Gaza from Hamas, okay? And we gotta take our hostages back, and we gotta do it now. And it's really not an easy thing. People are hiding their faces, and if they were so proud of what they're doing, they wouldn't be hiding. And it's really sad to see people denying that October 7th ever happened. It's like denying 9/11.
You spent a lot of your time since October 7th visiting American students to recount what happened. And a lot of Jewish students I know come up to you to express their fears and their concerns about the rise in anti-Semitism, even there in the United States. But what do you tell them in the context of what happened on October the 7th and the threats, the ongoing threats that Israel still faces?
Yeah, it's like you said, I've been around campuses around the States in Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, to really speak to the students, not only Jewish students, also non-Jewish students, to understand what is really happening. A lot of them are very afraid from all these enchantments because they're very, very violent. A lot of these enchantments, they claim they're peace activists, but in fact, they just spread a lot of hate and they do graffiti in all the monuments. So people don't feel safe in the campuses. I mean, how can you really live like that? This is bringing us back to 1939. You know, this is like a Holocaust kind of situation. I mean, people are afraid to walk on the streets without the Magen David. I mean, this is really, really dark times. And I tell to the people there, you got to stay strong, you got to be resilient, you got to create a dialogue, but not with the fanatic, with the radical people, because they won't want to listen. They just want to listen to their own kind of agenda. So the main messages are resilience and strength, and we're going to pass this, but we can't give this a voice. If we're silent about all these things, it's going to grow.
Yoni, I know some of this is difficult to talk about. We appreciate you coming on the program tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I hope the world will consume the right information by different media sources and not be misguided.
Yeah.
And we'll know better. Thank you.
Well, only by talking about it do we do that. So, Yoni, thank you for coming on.
Definitely.
Let's turn that over to our panel. Anja, do you think the world really understands, just listening to that, what the impact of this has been on the Israeli people?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. This is indeed the darkest day. The brutal terrorist attack by Hamas upended. It has this war 1 year on has had absolutely no winners. And my thoughts are really with the victims on all sides of this. You asked me specifically about how it's impacted Israel. I think this attack was really existential for Israel. I've heard several Israelis describe it to me as about as compare it to the first war after the creation of the Israeli state. They don't feel secure in their own homes and in their own country. From a Palestinian perspective, I think you have a feeling that nonviolent resistance got them nowhere. Netanyahu's strategy seemed to be to keep the Gaza and the West Bank politically divided. And 1 year on, we're no closer to a two-state resolution or to anything that would end this brutal conflict.
Justin, the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, the military leader, he wanted a cataclysmic war that would drag in the other proxies. But in many ways, it's not gone to plan for him. Gaza is in ruins. Hamas is battered. Hezbollah's leadership has been annihilated. The proxies are under severe pressure. And crucially, the Arab protests on the street have been pretty muted. So did he fail, or has he opened a Pandora's box that will not be easily closed?
Yeah, and you and I remember discussed this, almost a year ago. We said, what was Hamas looking to achieve with this? And I think the parallels with 9/11 that are made are very apt. Obviously, it's an order of magnitude larger for Israel than 9/11 was, if you think of the size of the country and the number of casualties. And I think Hamas knew that this was not something that was going to be handled in the normal manner, if you like, by Israel, particularly with the leadership at the time. And so I think they were looking to ignite a cataclysmic event and effectively martyr the people of Gaza, knowing that Israel would react strongly. So I think that part of their plan worked. I think obviously what hasn't worked since, in particular, is effectively the dismantling of Hezbollah recently. I think the showing of Iran's weakness, particularly in ballistic missiles, which have not proven to be the threat Iran maybe hoped they would have been, judged on results so far. And of course, Israel, I think, resolved to start dismantling Iran's proxy forces across the region. And of course, that the lot has turned against Israel. I think a lot hasn't, you say, particularly in the Arab street. And I think that was the flashpoint very early on that everyone was very anxious about, was how would the Arab world have to react? And after a year, I think a lot of the criticism might have come from there is muted, and that has not achieved the effect, I think, that they would like to have seen from Hamas. So some successes, like initial strong successes, and I think failure really with where they are now. Iran actually in quite a weak position compared to where it has been historically.
Emily, we're talking in the last hour about the things that divide Israelis currently. And I think what does confound Israeli society is that Israeli intelligence had no inkling of what was about to unfold on October the 7th, and yet had thoroughly penetrated and outwitted the command of Hezbollah. How do you explain that?
This is going to be an intelligence failure that will be explored for years and years to come. It is interesting that Israel was so focused on what was going on its northern border and with Hezbollah and was not paying as much attention to what was going on in Gaza with Hamas. It seems like they had just sort of assumed that Hamas was not capable of pulling off this style of attack, this complex an attack, and thus they had really transferred their attention to Hezbollah, which they saw as the A-team, and to Iran, which they see as an existential threat. That kind of mindset, that kind of bias can be really dangerous. And I think Israel is going to be looking at this for years to come to figure out what went wrong and they don't repeat the same mistakes again.
Was it just that, Kim, or was it also the splits that we saw before October the 7th within Israeli society about the government they had and the assault the government had begun on the Israeli judiciary? Did that perhaps encourage Hamas because they could see the weakness in Israeli society?
It may have done. It may have done, Christian. And Israel has been profoundly divided for a long time now, for years and years. It's about a decade since I was last there, but it was profoundly divided then and has been seems so ever on all the times I've been there. But perhaps Hamas did see that as an opportunity. Just one point, if I might add, to the discussion you just had, the very useful discussion you just had. Hamas, you're right, have not achieved many of the objectives they would have had when they undertook this brutal attack on the 7th of October. But just as this was being mounted, the Americans were in intensive negotiations with the Saudis over whether they would join the Abraham Accords and normalize with Israel. And that prospect has now gone away. I don't know whether it's gone away forever, but it's certainly gone back, and the Saudis have said, I think, no prospect of doing that until there is a two-state solution on the table for the Palestinians. So in that sense, one of the objectives that Hamas will have been after, that of stopping and destroying those negotiations between the Saudis and the Israelis, I fear they have achieved.
We'll talk more about that and the reaction of the Arab states a little later in the programme. We're going to take a short break, plenty more to come around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News. Welcome back. You might think on a day like this there would be a repose, perhaps a moment to reflect. And yet even today, in the midst of the silences observed, the sound of war was never very far away. The Israelis are active on a number of fronts with a very real chance of war between Israel and Iran, a scenario in which the United States could be sucked into a much wider conflict. But to what end? What is Israel's strategic objective and how far will they go? There is concern in the West. The Israeli Prime Minister has set his country on an almost unreachable threshold for victory. So let me start, Justin, with you on this. I mean, clearly there are a whole range of rich targets the Israelis could focus on. The Biden administration say they don't want them to go after the nuclear facilities, but let's face it, they have ignored the Americans before. What do you think that would precipitate?
yeah, as you say, over North Americans very recently, indeed, and going into Lebanon now. So I think there's no guarantee on that. The point was made, I think, in the previous part of the program. If you're going to do attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, you need to do it comprehensively, I would suggest. So it really depends on how comprehensive that is for a start, and whether that results in an acceleration of any Iranian nuclear program in place, because obviously at that point, Iran would really have very few options. More widely across the region, it depends whether this drags the US into it or not. And obviously, Israel would rather have the US on side. I think they'd rather have US support and strikes. Iran obviously would rather the US stayed out of this, I think, pretty clearly, with the weight of fire that could be brought to bear on Iran. And so it is just very hard to judge what Israel would really achieve and where it goes from there. I think the US would have to join in something. I think Iran would be very much looking at this as an existential problem in many ways. It possibly already is. And I think they're waiting with some trepidation to see what comes up. But actually, for them, any target set is not good. The oil and gas facilities are not good. The country is already struggling economically. Leadership targets are not good. And there is this feeling that I think Israel's in this for the kill at this point with Iran, and would love to see regime change there and this thing completely removed. So nothing off the table. I think a very highly volatile and unpredictable situation, whatever course Israel chooses.
Anja, there are 40,000 troops in the Middle East. The aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, the accompanying strike group is with it, and the fighter jets, of course, which are on board. They will all remain in the Gulf of Oman. How concerned are you that if we get a strike on Iran in the next few days, that the US might become more militarily involved?
I think it's not about whether I'm concerned or not. I think the United States is suitably concerned, and there are more dilemmas than easy answers all the way around here. You just heard in the previous answer, it's a little unclear what targets Israel will strike inside Iran. There are certainly lots of military targets. There are certainly targets of Iranian leaders that would escalate further. You could attack Iran's energy infrastructure. You could do a lot to harm Iran short of striking its nuclear facilities, which has been said on this program is incredibly difficult. Those are really deeply buried. And the United States, while trying very, very hard to get a ceasefire in Gaza, ultimately, unfortunately, unsuccessful, to tamp down this conflict, the United States is in it. And the United States has supported Israel all the way along. So I would imagine that U.S. commanders in the region are quite worried about being dragged in.
David Sanger wrote in the New York Times this weekend that we could be about to witness, and I'm quoting him here, an intersection of foreign conflict and a presidential election unlike any other in modern times. A remarkable collision of events, he wrote, that could shape the final weeks of the presidential campaign. It would, Kim, put the vice president in a considerable bind, this, because if she embraces the strike as a justifiable act of self-defence, despite the appeals from the White House not to escalate the situation, she risks a run-in with the progressive side of her party. But then, were she to criticise the Israeli action, she will likely be accused by the right of being weak in defending Israel. So you can see, when we talk about an October event, 29 days to the election, this has big ramifications for American politics, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, you've described the situation very well. I think the Biden administration, but her personally, are in a very difficult position on this. I find it unlikely that really whatever Israel does against Iran, that she can detach American support from Israel for that action. So I think that the diplomatic channels will be hot with American pressure not to go for one of the heavier, the more extreme, the more escalatory options. And the escalator, I mean, the nuclear thing, previous speaker is quite right. I'm not sure Israel has the capacity actually to do serious damage to the Iranian nuclear program. It's so well protected. And if you go for oil infrastructure, the Iranians have form, in terms of, go back to the 80s, of retaliating against Western commercial oil shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. And my guess is that's exactly where they would turn, and that would push oil prices up instantly. So it's really difficult in any circumstances, but extraordinarily difficult when you're 30 days off an election.
Emily, we're already starting to see some evidence of that, this fear of a global oil crisis. There's some thought that's been written about tonight that an Israeli strike on the oil installations would prompt Iran to target other refineries in the region, Saudi Arabia perhaps, or the United Arab Emirates. And then, as Kim says, I mean, we've seen in the past where they threaten the passage of the tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. So this could be, I mean, again, when you're looking at the political ramifications of this, 29 days from an election, it's pretty serious for the Vice President, is it not?
It is. She does have a really hard dilemma. I mean, the good news is that she's very strong. She's very confident on foreign policy. Where she really has a problem is Michigan. For those of you who are not American viewers, Michigan is one of the swing states that often decides an election, and there's a very large Arab American population there. And they've been quite outspoken about Israel's activities around the region. I'm not sure that the Iran aspect would make that big of a difference in Michigan, but it could make a difference elsewhere. Oil prices, always an issue in an election, and Iran has been known to lash out across the region, going all the way back to the cyber attack they conducted on Saudi Aramco that really threw them off for, I think, something like 2 weeks. They have lots of tools in their toolkit to disrupt oil production, and that could have a real impact on the world economy. That is not something that Vice President Harris wants right as she's running for president.
Yeah, and if you doubt that, you only need to look at the oil price, which has been going up since Thursday last week. Indeed, we're now up, I think, over $70 a barrel. It's clearly some concerns out there about what might happen in the days ahead. And Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, heading to Washington tomorrow. We have to say goodbye to Anja Manuel. She's very busy today. Our panelists always are because they're good. But Anja, thank you very much for being with us on the programme. Always good to have your company. We're going to talk about the Arab states the other side of the break. Kim set us up very nicely about Saudi Arabia. So we'll get into a bit of that and see where we might be headed in the months ahead and how the Arab states might play a role in that. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello there. Such a lot to talk about with the weather story in Europe at the moment. We are in autumn proper.